So welcome everyone to Retailing in the Cloud, Modernizing Software for Digital Transformation, a collaboration between Codurance and Redis Labs. And for those who don't know what Codurance or Redis are, Codurance is a software consultancy firm that specializes in software modernization with a strong focus on Agile, DevOps, and extreme programming practices. And Redis Labs is the home of Redis, the world's most popular multimodal in-memory database that provides superior performance, reliability, and a better total cost of ownership. I am José Rodríguez Huerta. I'll be your host in today's session. This will be a very relaxed fireside chat style kind of conversation where each of the participants will be sharing some of their experiences in the topic. If during the event there is a question that comes to mind and you want to ask it, just write it in the chat and we'll make sure that it gets to the group. And with that out of our hands, we can jump right into it. Today we have three super guests with lots of experience in retail who have worked with the likes of Sainsbury's, ASOS, Mango's, Marks and Spencer, Tesco, and the list goes on. On one side we have Mashooq Badar. He's the co-founder at Codurance, craftsman at heart, who's been developing software for almost 20 years. And he's one of the founders of the London software craftsmanship community. Hi, Mash.
Hello.
We have Lars Rosenquist. He's a partner solution architect at Redis Labs with, again, over 17 years of experiences building software and designing scalable platforms. Hi, Lars. How's it going?
Hello, everyone.
Good. And last but not least, Matt Walton. He's a senior director of sales for EMEA at Redis Labs, and he's a change leader in business strategy who's spent the last 25 years helping businesses be more effective and productive. I am very happy to have you all here, and let's start introducing the topic a little bit, right? Because in the last year and a half, 2 years, everything has changed, right? Like COVID hit and suddenly it disrupted every industry, and some businesses have been thriving out of this crisis situation. Others haven't fared so well. How do you think this is impacting the retail landscape? And let's start, I don't know, with Lars.
Yes, thank you, Jose. So there's a couple of things that we have seen in the retail landscape that changed during the COVID times. So a couple of things that we saw is that, of course, what we saw is that retail spending in consumers went down a lot as most countries were imposing lockdowns and other kinds of measures, which means that people had to change their spending patterns a lot. It also means that customers changed their spending to a more online spending. So that shifted a lot of the attention from the traditional retail situation more in the online situation. But that was not all. We also saw that as government imposed more and more measures, and measures also changed over time, we also saw that there were new patterns emerging, and we also saw that customers responded, in a different way to those kind of changes. And a good example of this is that because of store closures all across Europe, but also in some cases stores opening but in a limited way, we see that customers have changed the way that they shop, for instance. So instead of having multiple small trips to individual stores, customers have now started consolidating their trips into stores. So that also means that from a retail perspective, we now have, instead of having a small basket in play, it means that they have a larger basket in play. So it means that the stakes have become significantly higher. What we also saw is that consumers have a very strong preference for online retailers that can provide experiences like contactless payments, but also things like curbside pickup or in-store pickup, starting their journey in the online situation and then continuing in the store, or vice versa, for instance.
All right. So definitely we've adapted to the current context now. Is that something that is planned to stay?
Well, what we see in general, and we also did some research on this topic, is that there will be a lasting effect, but it will not be 100% effect. So we saw, of course, during the crisis with the lockdowns that consumers shifted their their attention from retail, physical retail to online retail, almost 100%. We do expect that to fall back as more things start to open up. I mean, people are actually enjoying to go to a mall or to a store and to do their thing. So we do expect, let's say, those levels to drop, but they will not drop by 100%, because what we see is that because this COVID situation lasted for so long, it also had a lasting impact on the customer behavior because it turned into a habit.
Lars, one thing is, even before the COVID era, I worked with a few retailers where their bricks and mortar operations were kind of almost coming down. They were traditionally bricks and mortar kind of businesses, and their online or e-commerce, which was kind of meant to be a very small, we also do this with a very kind of limited range and that kind of thing, started going up. And it seems that even before the COVID era, this trend was continuing towards the e-commerce, the online kind of business becoming larger and larger, and the bricks and mortar shrinking. And that has, I guess, accelerated in the COVID era, but there's always been this kind of transition going on, I guess.
Yeah, there is this meme going around, right? Like, who led the digital transformation in your organization, right? COVID or the CTO, or no? Multiple choice. So yeah, that's definitely something that we're seeing a lot. You know, things that were kind of an already they take is basically a matter of survival to some extent, no? And what do you think are the characteristics that these businesses that are thriving have, that make them, let's say, able to navigate this crisis or context more effectively than the rest?
Hey, Jose, there's a couple of good points in there. I think if we look at managing risk as a top priority in any business, and managing risk around becoming as flexible as you can within your architecture to cope with the ever demanding changes and needs in the business, I think maybe what COVID has done has pushed that higher up the agenda. So if we look at maybe bricks and mortar or online, I think maybe the thing that we're starting to see more of is the flexibility to drive change at pace has been pushed up the agenda even harder and even faster. I have some views, and my view is, when we read the reports, they're just reports based on the best information we have at the time. We don't really know what the ongoing impacts will be. What we do know as business leaders is whatever we develop should be as flexible as possible. And I think there's a few things from the conversations I'm having with CIOs, and that is still not to put all your eggs in one basket, but whatever you're creating, developing, delivering has to have that flexible plug and play ability to expand, to scale at will. And I think those are some of the things we're seeing. And I think one of the other things is, obviously, with the changing habits and buying behaviors, data is even more important to understand what's actually going on. And I think some of the things we're seeing is we're now ending up with so much data. Maybe a lot of people don't know what to do with it, but maybe the end goal is, how do we monetize all of the data we've got so we're getting closer to the customer, getting closer to their behaviors? So I think, just to put a line under that, maybe everything's around the continuous flexibility of whatever we're creating, so we can deal with whatever comes along, and we can manage and pivot where we need to. I think that's the message I want to try and share with the people on this call from the conversations I'm having particularly.
Yeah, and of course, cloud providers have a super important role to play in that sense, right? Like providing that flexibility. If before you had, your on-premise and the infrastructure you need to manage yourself, when you find yourself suddenly with a peak or with this need for an extra boost, that's a lot harder now, depending on how your organization works internally. That's a lot harder to fulfill than if you're building your systems on top of a platform that can allow you to scale on demand and with a lot more flexibility. So what do you think is needed in order to then embark on this transition or this journey? And what are some of the challenges that usually people find when trying to adapt right into this new context?
So I think coming back to managing risk again, I suppose it's very easy to always be watching the latest trends and feel that you have to put all of your emphasis on that. I think the reality is, if you take a bricks and mortar business that's been around for 130 years, you're not going to throw everything in the cloud. You're not going to go everything in cloud native, because you've got some inherent systems that are built over a number of years. So I think the view I've had from my own experiences and the conversation I'm having is, how do we sustain all levels of the business? So when we're expanding into new innovation, yes, we need to be flexible, but also we need to be bearing in mind that unless we understand the legacy and the history, we're going to end up with two different strategies. And that's one of the things we're seeing when a lot of companies have got a cloud push. Actually, the reality is maybe some of the data is still inherent in some of the AS400 and the mainframe systems and the legacy systems. So understanding that data strategy is maybe a good point to start from, and that helps drive where do we innovate, where do we drive in the latest technologies, but also making sure we're keeping the lights on and doing the right thing with the back end.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
that's it.
Yeah. So comprehensive data strategy is where I think maybe some people don't put enough effort. They've got application and modernization strategies, but data is at the heart of actually understanding the history of the business and how to push that forward.
It's a really important point, Matt, is that the ERP systems of a lot of these retailers, very large retailers, they have been there for a very long time indeed. And in fact, their IT departments were these ERP systems. And so they are huge. The work that goes on them is huge, and they are based on more traditional kind of technologies, and they are in data centers and those kind of things. And I have seen personally transformation being driven from that side as well, because they often when the drive for like omni-channel experiences comes through, it's in a lot of these cases it goes to what they call the IT department, which is the kind of the more ERP side of things, which is the largest part. And even on their side, when they've tried to kind of modernize their systems, and they've kind of thought of it more from the point of view of the ERP systems, and they've tried to modernize those and almost kind of created this API side of things, so that integration with e-commerce side can happen, or online thing can happen. And that's actually the wrong approach. That's almost saying that we're going to modernize ourselves and then we're going to think about you later on, but rather kind of coming together and creating a more holistic technical vision, the data strategy being an integral part of it. Right?
Yeah. And, a couple of other things, just to raise, and everyone has a different challenge and has a different perception on the world based on their experiences. But, I suppose a few years ago, there was a huge push on getting Agile, become a product management focused organization, microservices, et cetera, lean Agile teams. And I suppose going back in time, some of the challenges we had around ETL, data warehouses, data marts, they were actually fantastic. But there was maybe some challenges. Any minor change used to take months. So from the Agile and lean transformation going to cloud native, we solved maybe a lot of those problems. But maybe some of the other things to think about, going back to the data strategy, is we might now have new products that have a full stack, that are managed by self-managed teams, they have the ability to make their own decisions, quick, rapid change. But without a comprehensive data strategy, we've now ended up with data absolutely everywhere. So coming back to getting a 360 view of the customer is still an inherent challenge. And I think if we're now looking at the impact of COVID pushing a lot of business online, there's still the challenge of how do you now create a customer experience and consolidation between in-store commerce and online commerce? And without that data strategy, that still creates separation.
And you have this data pools or data swamps, you know, and then what do you do with that, right? Like how do you make sure that they are looked after and part of your architecture and your strategy for the technology and the business itself, right?
Yeah. And just on that point, Jose, just coming back to the importance of, you know, so yes, I'm a technologist, but I've always been a fan, and everyone's different, but I've been a fan of technology is there to enable the business to grow. So if you look at data and, you know, the data swamps, etc., we've now got so much data, but unless we understand what's the data we really need and why we need it, we end up with so much data we potentially don't know what to do with it. So, you know, I don't want to keep going over that point, but that's where I'm seeing the majority of the big conversations.
Can you think of other challenges besides maybe related to data or specific legacy technologies and so on that people are finding or struggling with during this transformation? Besides, you know, also looking at the aspects like processes and people and so on.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. So let's just think of a product management strategy, products within an organization. So if we go back in time to functions, you know, there was a business analysis function, there was a design function, a build function, and now we're trying to get to a point to say, hey, let's own the stack. Let's take Smart Shop, for example, in Sainsbury's. You know, that's a product in itself, top to bottom. So the positive things around that are you get ownership of the product. You can drive the priorities of the product based on the research and the buying behaviors and where you need to take it. But unless there's a comprehensive lineup of all of the products to show how that integrates into the overall strategy, you potentially could end up with silos again. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing around self-formed managed teams, you know, I actually did start off as an engineer years ago. So I was a huge fan of, you know, DSDM or Rational Unified Process and taking control of iterative development. But it's also understanding that every single person within that team has a different view of the importance of their role and the impact. So some of the things that I've seen and experienced is, you know, let's take the Agile mindset and Agile change. You know, in Agile, everyone wants to release code 20, 30, 40 times a day, which is a huge improvement to 3 or 4 times a year. But, you know, let's just take a peak trading and you release an Agile change that potentially brings down every single line in every single store, and you've got 20 people in a store. So we also have to understand that the impacts of Agile and Lean, where there's good, there's always some challenges as well. So I see, you know, process, you know, I'm a big fan of removing overheads of process, but it's also understanding the impact of change into the business. And I think unless IT people understand the impacts of business and the opposite way around, we still have a misalignment, if that makes sense.
I think, Matt, in a lot of these cases, change often does not mean that, you know, you make change in a way that risks everything. So like this all or nothing approach. Actually, the all or nothing approach comes from a bit more of a taking large releases, taking lots of time over them, you know, having that kind of code freezes and downtime and all the rest, right? But moving forward, along with this, companies that do frequent changes successfully is that they make the cost of failure very small.
Agreed.
So when you are releasing changes, you know, it's a case of, is this gonna, if it goes wrong, will it then bring the business down, or it may cause a problem with a small population? And so, you know, there are things like canary releases and all those kind of release strategies, and A/B testing and all these kind of things at the feature level as well, where you are trying to reduce the risk of change.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we're going into a bit of a tangent, because this is a much more generic, let's say, a discussion in terms of how to manage change, which is actually relevant for all organizations, not just retail.
Agree. Yeah. And I think just to underline that, the understanding and the maturity of the organization allows you to assess where you are within that.
Yeah, Lars.
Yeah, and I think it's good to understand, and Mashooq already sort of said that, right? That data and applications go hand in hand. So it's not just about, let's say, modernizing your data strategy and empowering or cleaning out your data swamps or your data dumpsters, or however you want to say it. But it's also about having the ability to be able to deliver in small iterations in a controlled way, so you don't break the business. So these things always go hand in hand, and we typically also see that there's a variety of, let's say, maturity in different types of customers on those levels. And like Mashooq said, I think it's very important to, if you want to sort of find a way out of that swamp, it's that you sort of need to reverse the way of thinking and start thinking about the customer first and what you want to do for a customer first. And then you start questioning about, hey, what kind of data do I need to make those kind of decisions around the customer? And then you will find, let's say, if you have, let's say, a large pool of data and it is a big mess, then you can start identifying the pieces in that data lake or whatever you want to call it, and to get the pieces of information out that you actually need. And maybe you can discard the rest later.
Yeah. And good point there, Lars, because, you know, if we look at maybe what's the major challenge or top of the agenda, which is the customer experience and customer journey, to fully optimize that, if we go from single channel, multi-channel, omni-channel to algorithmic channeling, to get as close to the customer as possible, we need to understand the data we want to collate and how the data is related to the application. So I think that's, you know, bringing data and apps together is exactly, I suppose, the huge challenge that we're working on and what we're seeing.
There are other areas also, right? Because when you're talking about the total cost of ownership for the solutions and the systems that you have, that's also an important part, right? There's a mindset kind of shift between, you know, CapEx and OpEx, and how you start thinking about, you know, the products that you're building, not from a point of view of just a one-off investment and that's it, but you take a more holistic approach on, you know, how all of those things fit together, no, and how you're going to be also paying for them or scaling them as you need them, no? So at this point, it's not only about understanding, you know, the technology, but how to make that technology be also cost effective for the business, right? You can move to the cloud and spend a lot more than, you know, what you were doing on-prem, no? If you don't know how to do it in a cost-effective way, no, and what components to use and so on, right? So what are certain things that maybe organizations get wrong or have some sort of misunderstanding, let's say, when they're trying to solve these challenges?
I think I can start with something. I've noticed a few things where when they come to look at challenges, one of the first things that I've seen people think about is a kind of almost like a service bus or something in the middle that will connect everything else. And they end up creating this a new team, a new department that is then managing this thing. And it's not just about managing the platform or the tools to build that, but actually governing the thing as well. So they are the central body almost, governing how the different applications will talk to each other, and they themselves start coming up with kind of pseudo standards without even understanding the needs. And I think Lars said earlier as well, is they kind of put the cart before the horse, really. And this is something that I've seen gone wrong quite often, these kind of very large projects where they're building these central hubs almost that will then eventually get everything to be connected, rather than to actually start with flexible platforms that will make the this kind of integration easy, that will bring data close when it's kind of application to application, but then also start creating this almost like a tractor for standardizing but it comes from the need rather than kind of the overall, let's do the governance, let's do the full standardization of everything first, and then allow the different parts of the systems to come together, rather than actually start with providing the tools, the right kind of strategy and guidelines and a vision, and then allow things to kind of evolve towards that kind of more joined up picture.
And I think sometimes, when you're in a big organization and you're accountable for a lot of things, sometimes it's actually hard to know where to start. And, one of the things that I've seen work very well, not just from my own experiences, but with customers, is sometimes none of us actually know the answers to all of the problems. So actually to break the problem down into a small experiment and actually validate if our thinking or our drawings are correct before rolling that out is maybe another food for thought, because we're all constantly impacted with different things and maybe we don't know the answers. But actually by experimenting small to build out the actual reality and the actual results is maybe some good practice for us all to continue to do.
Yeah, it pays off to do, let's say, to invest in reducing that transactional cost of trying things out. It pays off in the end, because you are going to get things wrong, right? Like there are going to be mistakes or things that you didn't think about and so on, but the ability to lower the impact of those things, right, by being able to quickly fix it or recover from those, is something that we don't normally think of. We think of let's provide stability, right, and then we will do this big bang release, and then things will go okay, or we'll have some time to kind of level things up again, and then another big bang release. Whereas if you invest in making those experiments, or in making it easier for you to push out software and recover when things go wrong, it just makes the system more resilient, to some extent. You're able to adapt faster and try things faster, so the business is happy about that. But at the same time, when things happen, you can recover from them a lot faster, because you're used to doing that work, right?
It's like Matt was saying earlier as well. You kind of put the customer first, right? And you solve a real problem that your business is facing. So you create experiments based on that, and of course you will have a strategy and a vision to move towards a good approach, like a join up approach. But you need to be you need to be delivering value to the customer as early as possible, right? So I think those experiments, they're not just about proving hypotheses. They are actually about proving real world kind of improving real world problems that your product has, right? And if it works, then you kind of go with it. You don't actually kind of go back and then start another experiment and another one and start kind of accumulating something towards a bigger plan. What you're doing is incrementally experimenting, delivering value, kind of learning and moving towards a better picture.
And I think that also plays into culture as well, because the reality as humans, maybe all of us sit back until we think something's going to work. So the good thing about if you're changing direction within a company, or trying to get more agile, or trying to do these latest and greatest things, the reality is most people don't want to fully commit until they see it working. So apart from an experiment showing the good results, sometimes that's the impetus and the traction for other people to see this new way of working or this new way of doing things is actually beneficial, not just for the organization, but for the team and the person. So that's another thing to really think about, maybe in any of these transformations or change programs. It's all about getting the people to see the value and in the change as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to realize, I mean, what we also see where a lot of these transformations fail is because customers try to solve the whole world in one go, right? Or as we sometimes say, when they try to eat the elephant in one sitting, right? And that's typically a really good way to end up with a situation like Mashooq described, where you create some kind of central solution that tries to fix everything and that tries to fix all, which will of course fail, because that's not how the world works today. So it's also really important to really focus on those things that are the most important. So if you're looking at retail, sort of, what's the one thing that's impacting your business right now? What's the one thing? And then try to fix that and work your way from the customer scenario back to applications and to data solutions. And how do you want that how do you want all these things to come together? And that will decide sort of how you have to build your architecture, how you have to build out your components, and also what kind of data solutions you're going to pick in your architecture in order to support those mechanisms.
Yeah, because you're going to be having issues, right? Like I remember recently we were talking to CTO for Mercadona Online, right? And he said, like, we have built in, checks, no, so that we don't overload the system. But when COVID hit, we had the same amount of requests, no, achievements to fulfill, but they were bigger. So that created also strain somewhere else in our system, right? Because we have all of the logistics, we have all of the other areas that are kind of like working to try and keep up. So you are going to find things that you didn't plan for. So how, let's say, are people solving some of these issues? Like you mentioned before, Lars, deciding how you're going to structure, let's say, your architecture, how you're going to tackle certain problems. Could you give some examples of how people are solving these challenges, let's say, with speed and so on?
Yeah, so when it comes to, let's say, if we look at existing landscapes, typically we're dealing with systems that have been built maybe long before, let's say, the cloud era even. So there's a lot of, let's say, aging systems. At the same time, you don't want to say goodbye to these systems because they're still providing a lot of value for you. So you want to find a way of bringing these systems in a modern area. So some of the patterns that we typically see is that you, instead of engaging with those systems directly, is that you build either a data layer in between, let's say, your front-end applications or your more modern applications, and in between your legacy applications, so that the applications that are closest to your customer, so the applications that you're using in your mobile application or in your website or maybe in a store application, can get access to data quickly and the most relevant data quickly and also in a reliable way, without putting a strain on those legacy systems, and also without having to wait on those legacy systems. And that will create a situation in which it's possible to have, let's say, almost the best of both worlds, in which you say, hey, we can still leverage the power and the functionality of those aging systems, while at the same time also building new functionality on top of the cloud and with all the features that public cloud can offer, and in that sense also with auto scaling and whatever not, and cross-region deployments and etc. And that will all still work, right?
There is I did actually a talk last with Luis from Redis a while back, and this was around this thing actually, because often these old systems, they are sharing information with other systems, right? And normally what has happened is traditionally we've done it with messages and batch requests and so on, and it's always been point to point. And what we talked about is kind of this concept of immobilizing data, so that when these systems are sharing information, that information is almost kind of kept in some place in a way that allows it to be accessed again. So although it's delivered, but it's still there. So you start building this almost like a communication strategy where you can always see what happened before, and that then allows other systems and applications and start evolving, but still having a very all these kind of older systems or legacy systems playing a key part in the whole thing. But it's one way of kind of getting all these systems to take part. But then you come to kind of requiring platforms that allow for notification but persistence at the same time, and those kind of things become more important. But it's a much a different talk altogether.
What kind of skill sets or tooling do you think is necessary for an organization that is undergoing, this kind of transformation, let's say?
Well, tooling and skills. I think there are.
Because I feel like, we're talking about, releasing quickly, we're talking about, all these things, but those things require you to do business as usual, but at the same time continue to evolve. No, and it's a bit like, changing the car's wheels, while you're on the car and it's running, and you have other stuff that you also need to get done. No? So I'm thinking from that perspective, as well as the tooling that you use for that. It can make your life a lot harder or a lot easier, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing is that one of the reasons we are talking together is as Redis and Codurance is that you've got certain solutions that are designed in such a way that they provide this kind of early experimentation, and also allow you to become a more and more let's say kind of platform oriented as you grow, right? So I think one thing is that the kind of solutions that you work with, you need to kind of see, are they allowing you to work in an incremental fashion, right? So that's one thing. And of course, there's practices, there's the ways of organizing as well that comes into it. And we haven't done this in the past. In the past, like especially, I worked in many large organizations, and when it comes to applications communicating with each other, you have a massive a department that handles messaging. Right? So you ask them to create a topic or a queue or something, and then you start publishing messages there. You don't even know what's happening on the sense, you just know that. And same with the databases and persistence, so on. You ask the big database admin team to create you a new database schema on something big. So you that kind of ways of working, that way of organizing needs to evolve as well if you want to work in a more evolutionary way, and if you want to work in a way where you can actually start benefiting from kind of this kind of integration or the space between all those systems. And of course, there's a lot of other techniques around bringing all these silos together from a technology vision, but also to allow them to work in a more autonomous way. So this kind of that, like having a joint strategy, but still be able to work separately. Those kind of things, they're all also skills that you need, that I think a lot of the organizations working in silos have not necessarily built a lot of strength in that area.
And one of the things that we also see in that sense is, let's say, the change from silos to something that I would call a platform team, where let's say you have individual product teams who are building out individual products or software products or whatever. But in the end, you also treat your platform like a product. So instead of that being a silo, you do have, let's say, a data platform team or an application platform team who manage the platform and have the developers as their customers, and who are using the developers to create new features, etc., and to make sure that developers can do things in a self-service way, so that things are automated and that they don't have to file, 20 tickets in order to request a single resource, which then goes wrong and it takes them 6 weeks. Now, developers these days, they want to act like they act in the public cloud, which is they can do everything self-service, and they can just, request a resource, and a couple of minutes later it's provisioned. And everything that was required to run that thing into production has also been settled. So you can monitor it, you can maintain it, you can run the upgrades or preferably automate it. Things like chargebacks or costs are also automatically done into the team. And I think there is really a shift that we can see in successful organizations that make the shift to these kind of, so instead of having a centralized IT department, the IT department itself, or the systems department, depending on how that's called in your organization, will also become composed and also become more agile instead of these sort of strict silos and departments.
Yeah, because you get more, let's say, efficiency that way. Like you can optimize for a particular function, but then you lose when it comes to the whole delivery of value for the organization, right? Because it's not just about a function. The function can provide some value, but what actually your customers care about, is the interaction between all of those functions and how they manage to, get the product on their hands and so on, right? And that's a.
So Jose, it's funny, as everyone's talking, I'm imagining being back on the other side of the fence. Obviously, I spent so many years there. And it's funny, every external consultancy that came in, I sort of felt it was slightly different to the reality we faced. Because on paper, all of this stuff always sounds very, very good. But the reality is you've got an organization that actually isn't functioning like that. And you've potentially got people in jobs that might not have jobs. So if you take automated testing, maybe there's a function with regression testers, system testers, performance testers. And so actually, I think the North Star we're all aligned on, but actually the biggest thing for an organization is how do you transition from A to B? So actually, from a technology and tooling and process perspective, I wouldn't say it's simple, but there's a lot of information on what you need, automated tool chains, CI/CD, et cetera, et cetera. But I actually think the biggest challenge is how do you bring your people along that potentially were release managers, spent all night. I mean, I remember walking the floor on a 24-hour release in M&S, line by line, sitting with the release managers. All those. So it's understanding the North Star from a tooling perspective, but also what is the coaching and enablement you're doing to your team? Because if you look at transformation, a lot of transformation fail, and that's because of the whole operating model isn't transitioning successfully. So I think maybe that's another point for everyone on the call. Maybe they're experiencing things like that. But to get to the tooling and the process North Star, you need to bring in the people and coaching your people and upskilling them on the way. And I think maybe that's a very good point for us all to be cognizant of in any transitional transformational piece we're working on.
Yeah, it is a very good point, actually. It's the most difficult part of any transformation, the people, right? And if they have their kingdoms, and suddenly different way of working means that the kingdoms are threatened, they will resist it. So how do you then move them on towards a different way of working, right? Yeah,
and it's a good one because maybe we all resist everything until we understand the benefits and why we need to change. Mm-hmm. So it then comes down to maybe it's the people not resisting, maybe we're not communicating as well as we should be. And then it's a balance between both sides, because the why we need to change maybe gets missed sometimes, and it's more the what are we going to be doing. But if we want people to follow the direction and endorse the direction and fully get behind it, the why and the benefits of the why and the impact of do nothing is another part of that transformation. If that makes sense.
I mean, it's actually even more than communication. It's about having them be a part of the solution creation, a part of the strategy and so on, right? Often when we run the software modernization kind of discovery exercises, one of the things that we ask, and people are sometimes quite surprised by it, is that we want to talk to the people on the ground who sometimes don't have a lot to do with the actual software creation part, or none at all, right? And we want to talk to those people to try to understand. And what normally happens is that when you have asked these questions early and you bring them as part of the discussions at a very early on, They feel like they are, brought in as part of the solution, and it's much easier to take the organization towards a direction when you're involving everybody at the start than when you are giving them a solution and say, okay, this is the new way of working.
And if we circle back round to the experiment of a product, you've got the people, the process, the tech, and the culture within that little experiment. Mm-hmm. So now we've taken the people in a self-formed managed team. We're given the opportunity to create new processes, automation, new systems, and by delivering quickly and effectively and proving value, the culture becomes positive. And I think if you then take that and say, here's the experiment with people, process, tech, and culture, if it's worked, that's what drives the ambition and the traction in any other transformation. So I think that's a good circle back round to that point about the experimentation and getting involved.
So I'm conscious of time, and we wanted to give some time for people to ask questions and so on. Before we go into that, are there any last thoughts or recommendations for our attendees that are maybe approaching these challenges, maybe where to start or good reference to go look up or something like that?
I mean, I think for me, the number one thing is make sure the data strategy is aligned with whatever modernization strategy you've got, because you have to bring in legacy and innovation together. And normally understanding the data allows you to make the right decisions of anything else, which then brings you closer to the customer. And then obviously getting close to the customer ultimately makes more money for you because you're providing the customer with what they need and want. So that would be it from my perspective.
I think from my point of view, it's about coming up with a common strategy and kind of echoing the last bit of discussion we just had as well, bringing people along. So making sure that you're tackling the right problem, start small, have a vision for something much bigger and grand, and have a good strategy, but then start small.
Yeah, and I would like to say, let's say from a technology perspective, I think having both an application platform or a platform as a service, as well as a data platform is very essential to the success of your modernization strategy. So having those things in place and having those things in place in a way that's self-service to your developers is going to be critical to your success.
Yeah, I would also add in there that it is a difficult journey. Yeah, and it's a very long journey, and it's probably a journey that you don't want to do on your own. There's plenty of, every organization is different, but the solution to some of these challenges are not evident, but they are problems that have been solved in the past, right? So having someone with you that have seen these things in the past, what work has options for it and so on is also good a way of approaching it, whether that is through bringing new talent into the organization that has already deal with these things, or some other mechanism. That's one aspect of that, right? Like find someone to help you with that. Yeah. Okay, so let's go into questions before we finish. Are there any questions on the chat? Or if you had a question, something you wanted to explore, but maybe we didn't touch on, please go ahead and put it in the chat so that we can discuss it. Okay, in the meantime, let's share the poll results while people are waiting. So you can see more or less what is out there. So there's a lot of legacy systems slowing down the business for sure. And speed of delivery, right? Like there's a lot to be done and very little time for it, especially when you have to react to, in crisis mode and things like this.
Yeah, it'd be interesting I mean, I'd love to talk to anyone if it was the right thing to do, but understanding, you know, the speed of delivery and how that gets hampered by legacy, because, you know, maybe that's the biggest challenge. You know, when you've got a greenfield site to create a cloud native, you know, app, I wouldn't say it's the hardest thing in the world, but when you're actually integrating with legacy, where maybe half the knowledge has left the company, you've got COBOL, thousands of lines of COBOL, you know, maybe those are the things that everyone struggles with. So it might be good to see if that's a common thing, and see if we can help and share anything about that.
I can give an example of, let's say, a legacy application, and this might not have been in a retail context. This was actually a bank that I talked to. They had a commercial off-the-shelf application running in the basement of the bank for about, I think, 45 to 50 years. So that's very long time they had this application running. The developers, or the original vendor of the software, has long gone. So they built a lot of automation around that. They've had also 45 years of reorganizations. So the knowledge of that application in the organization was also extremely limited. So now they have the ambition to start moving these applications into the cloud. So how do you do that? Because you have an application that's almost 5 decades old. You have no knowledge about the application, and there's also very limited willingness from developers to start filling with the application because it's so old. At the same time, this was a wholesale application, and it created value of 500 million euros per day. So that was an application sort of like, I mean, it's old, but we also cannot throw it away.
But it works.
Yeah, but I mean, in the end, it's sort of like, it becomes a risk, right? Because you cannot do security updates anymore, and it's depending on old middleware systems, etc. So you get this whole sort of stream or pool or sort of an oil spill of old stuff that you cannot get rid of. So one of the things that they could do in that sense was use a pattern like change data capture in order to capture the changes from the database and put them into something like a Redis cache into the public cloud, which allowed them to build, let's say, new functionalities on top of the cloud. And of course, you will start doing this in read-only mode. And they started to be able to develop these new type of features on top of the public cloud with modern techniques and modern practices. That also allowed them.
Breaking out, no? Allowing them to break out a bit out of that model, no, and continue evolving, taking advantage of the new.
Exactly. And one of the first things that they did was to start a testing framework, sort of a scaffolding framework around the application in order to assert, let's say, hey, what's this application actually doing, and what do we need to do in order to replicate this functionality? And by doing that, and also by analyzing the traffic that went into this application, they were able to develop new features, and then slowly sort of, what would they call applying a strangulation pattern in order to divert traffic from the application onto the new features. And that's one of these sort of situations where, you don't really have to touch the old application, but you can sort of set up a new framework besides that application and extend out into the modern world, so to say, and to start working with these applications and find a way to create additional value without throwing them away straight from the bat, because that's sort of really, really high risk, right? So that's the one example that's trying to find.
We have a question. Sorry, you were
sorry, go on, Jose.
So we have a question here. So how do you align your technology to the critical touch points and customer journeys?
That's funny, because I did a workshop about 2 weeks ago for a client to do exactly that. But in that particular case, we used a workshop format called Service Blueprint, which is actually we adapted it to some level, but the Service Blueprint allows you to create a customer journey, the evidence behind it, and then it has this front of office and back of office interaction that it creates. In this case, they had a distributed monolith, which was about over 30 different systems that were talking to the same database. And we were trying to understand which one of those systems touches at what part of the journey. And they were a huge logistics network. So they didn't really know who's kind of touching what in certain ways as well, and what's happening. So we actually invited the whole company. We invited people from their warehouses and the drivers, people who do the kind of some of the logistics aspects. and with the developers and everybody else as well, to then map out the journey and then to see how that connects to the different aspects of the systems, and also where the duplication is when same kind of thing is happening in lots of different places.
All of that online as well.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why another big challenge in doing something like that. We have another question here. Are these challenges discussed applicable to startups, digitally native e-commerce businesses, as well as traditional bricks and mortar retailers?
So I would say that the traditional bricks and mortar retailers have a lot more challenges, because they're trying to integrate the old legacy and the old systems, the old processes, the old operating model with the new. If you take a brand new startup, which is a greenfield, you know, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's easier because you're more focused on the direction you want to take it in. So if you take ASOS, for example, you know, ASOS, you know, architecturally, although it's a very complex architecture, it's not having to deal with 130 years of being in business in a legacy way. So I'd say a lot of the challenges are more related, from my experiences, into transitioning and transforming from the old into the new. And that's where the risk is, because you're trying to manage business as usual and with a transformational change program in parallel. When you're starting from scratch, you can build that flexible cloud native framework to start with. So that would be my view. I mean, Lars, obviously you're much more technical than I am, but is there anything you want to add to that?
I think in general, I mean, startups will have it easier because they're not carrying the burden of the legacy. But in the end, they will be converging on some of the same architectural patterns that the legacy stores will also be converging onto. And the head start that they have is that they can start with a blank sheet of paper.
There is one thing I would add to this, actually, is that when we talk about legacy, we automatically think of systems that are older. But actually, some of the systems, especially in startups that have gone through hyper growth, they get to legacy systems much quicker. Their systems become legacy in a matter of months. And also the startups that are actually growing often end up acquiring other companies that have systems of their own. And then you have like these truly siloed applications that then need to come together as well. So I think to answer to that original question, we've seen startups that are a couple of years old have problems with their systems that they wrote not long ago.
Yeah, it's probably worth defining what legacy means, doesn't it? Obviously, I'm getting a bit older, so legacy to me is COBOL and AS400, but you know, you could say J2EE could be legacy, like you're saying. So
yeah. Oh, yeah, I mean, even JavaScript and TypeScript and the modern languages are legacy as well. It's more to do with how you designed your code and whether it's easy or difficult to change. And if it's difficult to change, doesn't matter if you wrote it yesterday, it's still legacy.
Yeah, no, good point. Good point.
So we're right on time. Before we go, if people want to get in touch or would like to maybe continue the conversation somewhere else, is there any way they can reach you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to any discussions. If I can add some value or help, I'm always happy to. I might not be able to answer everything, but if people want to reach out for anything, I'm really happy to see if I can help.
Where would they find you, Matt?
Yeah, probably. Can you, if anyone wants to get my email address, anyone can email me, and I'm more than happy to try and help.
Okay. So we'll try to publish that also with when we release the videos and so on. Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
And from Codurance point of view, you can contact us at hello@codurance.com, but also contact us individually. But again, details will follow, I think, in the follow communication.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time. Thanks everyone who have joined us today to discuss this topic, and see you on the next webinar.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you for joining.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.